Well, I suppose my first experience of oysters was when my mother used to bring our entire family down onto the shore to pick periwinkles to supplement the family income. My father and my siblings, 3 sisters and a brother, we'd all troop down with our buckets to pick winkles. But very soon I spotted oysters on the shore as well, and I used to start picking those, even though this was highly illegal. But if you didn't get caught by the bailiffs, it was okay. You could probably sell them to some local buyers. The first day we dredged, I suppose, was the 1st of December 1977, and for the next few years after that, the oysters are very plenty. I farmed full-time, mixed farming, dairy, sheep, cattle, and did the oysters at Christmas, and carried on like this. As time went on, farming became sort of less profitable. I leased out my land and went full-time at the oysters instead. So that's where I am today.
Yeah, so our family have been involved for a long time. My father started the oyster sales business back in the early 50s. His father before him was an oyster dredger, an oyster fisherman, and there would have been the families before that would have been dredging oysters for many years before that as well. So a long time around. So we sell oysters all over Ireland and across into Europe, across to Canada and into Asia as well, into Singapore. So 14 different countries in between the whole lot.
The biggest problem with the native oyster happened during the mid-1980s. A disease was introduced from France called bonamia, which practically decimated the oyster in Clarenbridge. It can only be found now in a few small pockets. So the oysters changed from 1977, when there was about 100 boats dredging, to this year there's no dredging at all this year. There was a few last year and the year before, but the oyster has nearly died out.
The native oyster is very important to the area historically and also commercially for the community, and traditionally it provided a great income there for the winter months for the part-time farmers that used to go out fishing. It was, I suppose, through overfishing, through disease, through environmental changes, the catches have declined a lot in the last number of years. So much so that they didn't harvest any last year at all here in the local beds. And it's looking like a similar situation this year, so it could be another maybe 4 or 5 years before the native oyster will be back to any sort of commercial level. And that's a pity, because there's an awful lot of tradition and heritage lost with that then. The Oyster Festival started back in the early 50s. Paddy Burke and Brian Collins from the Great Southern in Galway, they were looking for some way of keeping the tourists around the area. So they came up with the idea of having an oyster festival. It became an integral part of the tourism in Galway and in the region. I said in the height of it, maybe 2,000 people attending in a marquee in a car park. Like it was amazing. For the Galway Festival, they have the oyster opening competition. So we get competitors from 20 different countries that travel to Galway to take part, and they open the native flat oyster as part of the competition. And that's great exposure then for us and for the oyster in those countries that they come from. They're going back home and they're talking about it, and they want to go and they want to get them.
So to compensate for the loss of the native oyster, another oyster was introduced to farm. This is a Pacific oyster, different shape. You see, kind of oval in shape, more meat in the shell. Not as tasty. The native one was smaller and sweeter, but and more valuable. But needs must, we started farming these using bags and trestles. We buy the small seed at maybe half the size of your small fingernail, and we keep them for about 3 years before they come to 2.5 to 3 years before they come to market size, having to shake them and grade them and work them in the meantime. So hopefully after 2.5 years then you have a saleable product.
So Cuan Beo is a local environmental organisation. We set it up back in March 2017 with a lot of concern about the quality of the water and how it was deteriorating, and no matter who we were talking to or campaigning about it, they didn't seem to listen or care. So a group of us got together March 2017 and we got funding from FLAG, Fisheries Local Action Group, and we set up Cuan Beo. So Cuan Beo means living bay, and it was to highlight the importance of the bay and the activities within the bay. It really captured something in people's imagination, and we were overwhelmed with the response. Another project we're involved with is the Native Oyster restoration project. So it's with the depletion in the stock, we're working with the Marine Institute to try and develop a restoration program where there's culch and shell put out into the bay with the view to collecting the young oysters and the spat. So to try and bring that fishery back to some sort of commercial activity. And we're happy with it. We're happy with the way it has developed.
Up along amid the rigging, swiftly blows like
This would be called culch, you know, the shell that they settle on. And we, in this experiment, we tried mussel shell and oyster shell and razor clam shell just to see what would be the best surface for them to attach to. And this year we took it a bit further and put out culch, threw it out on the seabed. We'll be analysing that later, that's about to come in here now. And we'll see what the settlement is like on that.
rolling home across the sea, rolling home.
Okay, this is an oyster shell, and this is young spat settled on it, and that will be this year's. So that's on an oyster shell, and this is one on a mussel shell. You can always tell that it's a native oyster because it'll leave a mark on the shell when you take it off.
It's hard to know how successful it's going to be. There's a few major factors there. In the relative short term, as of what time I've left in it, the next 10 or 20 years, I think we'll be okay. But for the next generation, there's a lot of work still to be done. There's a lot of drainage work going on into the bay at the moment, and that's changing the complex of the bay and the water. So if that changes too much, the native oyster won't survive. The Pacific oyster will, the farmed oyster will survive a little bit, but it's also under pressure. And the bay is changing, we can see that ourselves. Where is it going to be in the future? I don't know. Nature has a way of repairing itself, but I think with the work and with the awareness, there is hope. And when you see youngsters like Greta Thunberg and all these people, it gives you hope for the future.
We're hopeful with all the work that's been done by Cuan Beo and the Marine Institute on restoring the native oyster, that maybe one day we'll get back to where we once were, and that I can get my boat and start dredging again like I did all those years ago back in 1977.
Across the sea, rolling home to old New England, rolling home, dear land to me, rolling home, rolling home, rolling home across the sea, rolling home to old New England, rolling home, dear land to me.